This woman is named Sophia Nchama and her husband is called David Nkasia. However, this woman no longer lives with her husband because he immediately left her after she was seen in sex videos with Baltasar in Ngonga. Additionally, this woman claims that she became pregnant by Baltasar, but he doesn't want to help her or take responsibility. Listen to how she puts it.
I never imagined my life could spiral so far out of control. My name is Sophia, and this is my story, a tale of mistakes, consequences, and loneliness. It all began with my decision to stray from my marriage. My husband, David, and I had been married for 6 years. While we had our ups and downs, I always thought our bond was unshakable. But somewhere along the way, I let myself believe that the excitement of something forbidden could fill the void I thought I felt. That's when I met Baltasar in Ngonga. He was charismatic, confident, and everything that seemed to glitter. At first, it was harmless conversations, then dinners that turned into late nights. Before I knew it, I crossed a line that should have never been crossed. I told myself it was temporary, a thrill that wouldn't harm anyone. But the truth always has a way of surfacing. David found out. He confronted me, his face a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. He didn't yell, he didn't cuss. He simply told me he couldn't stay in a marriage where trust had been shattered. And just like that, he left. The man I had built my life with walked away, taking with him the love I had taken for granted. At first, I thought Baltasar might step in, offer me some comfort. But when I told him I was pregnant, his demeanor changed entirely. He avoided my calls, ignored my messages, and eventually disappeared from my life altogether. The man I had risked everything for didn't want anything to do with me. As if that weren't enough, a series of sex tapes I'd made with Baltasar during our affair surfaced online. I don't know how they got leaked, whether he shared them or someone else found them, but they became the talk of everyone I knew. My parents, horrified and ashamed, cut off all contact with me. My friends turned their backs, either out of judgment or fear of being associated with the scandal. Now, I'm alone. Pregnant, disgraced, and utterly abandoned. I've spent countless nights crying, replaying every decision that led me here. I see David's face in my dreams, the pain I caused him haunting me. I think of the child growing inside me and wonder if I can ever be a good mother when I've made so many mistakes. I wish I could turn back time. I wish I could undo the choices that destroyed everything I held dear. But wishes don't erase reality. Now, all I can do is face the consequences of my actions and try to rebuild my life, piece by broken piece. I met Baltasar in Ngonga at a business networking event about a year ago. David, my husband at the time, encouraged me to attend these events to expand my professional connections. Baltasar stood out immediately. He was charming, confident, and carried himself with an air of authority that drew people in. He wasn't just attractive, he had this magnetic presence that made it hard to ignore him. At first, our interactions were innocent. We exchanged numbers under the pretense of discussing business opportunities. Baltasar would occasionally text me about work-related topics, but soon, the conversations turned personal. He'd compliment me in ways that felt flattering yet dangerous. I should have stopped it there, but I didn't. We started meeting for coffee, then lunch. I told myself it was harmless, just two adults talking. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a line. Baltasar had this way of making me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I convinced myself it wasn't wrong until it was. The first time we slept together was about 2 months after we met. It happened during a weekend trip that Baltasar had invited me to under the guise of a professional conference. I lied to David, telling him it was strictly work-related. That night, after dinner and too much wine, I gave in to the temptation I'd been fighting for weeks. I remember waking up the next morning consumed by guilt but also exhilarated. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, but it wasn't. It became a pattern: secret rendezvous, stolen moments, and lies upon lies. Every time I promised myself it would be the last, I'd find myself drawn back to him, caught in the thrill of something forbidden. Looking back, I realize how foolish and selfish I was. I let myself believe that what I had with Baltasar was something special, but it was nothing more than a fleeting fantasy. A fantasy that ultimately cost me everything. As the affair continued, the lies started piling up. I became a different person: secretive, distant, and constantly on edge. David began noticing the change in me. He'd ask why I was coming home late, why I seemed distracted, or why I was glued to my phone. I always had an excuse: work meetings, deadlines, or just being tired. I could see the doubt in his eyes, but I dismissed it, convincing myself I was being careful enough. With Baltasar, things were intoxicating at first. He had a way of making me feel alive: compliments, laughter, and the excitement of being desired. But it wasn't long before cracks started to show. He wasn't the perfect man I had built up in my mind. He could be dismissive, arrogant, and possessive. There were moments when I felt like just another conquest to him, but I ignored the warning signs, too caught up in the whirlwind. The breaking point came one night when David found a message on my phone. I had been careless, leaving my phone on the kitchen counter while I went to take a shower. David never snooped, but something must have compelled him to check. When I came back, I found him standing there, pale, holding my phone. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse me. He just handed me the phone and said, "Is this what I think it is?" I froze, unable to speak. The message was from Baltasar, suggesting we meet at a hotel. The evidence was undeniable, and I couldn't lie my way out of it. David didn't press for details, he just packed a bag and left that night. The look in his eyes broke me more than any words ever could. I had destroyed the one stable, loving relationship in my life. After David left, I tried to lean on Baltasar. I thought he'd be there for me, especially when I found out I was pregnant. But when I told him, his reaction was cold and detached. He accused me of trying to trap him and insisted the baby wasn't his. The man who had once showered me with attention now wanted nothing to do with me. He cut off all contact, blocking my number and disappearing from my life as quickly as he had entered it. Then came the videos. I don't know how they were leaked, whether Baltasar had a hand in it or if someone else found them, but the damage was done. Explicit videos of us together began circulating online. My parents saw them, my friends saw them, and soon, the entire community knew. I became the subject of gossip, judgment, and ridicule. My parents disowned me, unable to face the shame. My friends stopped returning my calls, unwilling to associate with someone who had become a public scandal. Now, I'm left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. I'm alone, pregnant, and haunted by the choices I made. Every day is a struggle, to find a way forward, to forgive myself, and to figure out how to be a mother to a child who deserves so much better. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fix the damage I've done, but I know I have to try, for the sake of my child and for the hope of a better future. The videos are undeniable proof that my relationship with Baltasar wasn't a one-time mistake, it was an ongoing affair. I don't even know how many times it happened, I lost count. Each time, I would convince myself that it was the last, that I would stop and return to my life with David. But I didn't. The truth is, the affair became like an addiction. I would feel guilty after every encounter, but the guilt wasn't enough to stop me. Baltasar had this hold over me: his confidence, his charm, the way he made me feel like I was the center of his world, even if it was all a lie. I know now that I let myself be manipulated, but at the time, I was blinded by the thrill of it all. The videos were another layer of betrayal, even if I willingly participated in making them. Baltasar often suggested recording us during our encounters, and in the moment, I went along with it. It felt exciting, risky, like we were doing something taboo. But I never thought for a second that those private moments would one day be exposed for the world to see. When the tapes leaked, it was like my worst nightmare coming to life. Not only was my betrayal exposed, but it was laid bare in the most humiliating and public way possible. People didn't just know that I cheated, they saw it. They saw every moment of my weakness, my poor judgment, my mistakes. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a spectacle. And yes, the sheer number of videos made it clear to everyone that this wasn't a one-off incident. It was a pattern, a relationship, if you can even call it that. I had betrayed my husband repeatedly, over and over, with no regard for the consequences. And now, I'm paying the price for it. Baltasar, of course, denied everything. He claimed the videos were leaked without his consent and that he had no involvement, but I don't know if I believe him. He was always so calculated, so in control, that it's hard to imagine him not having a hand in it. But at this point, it doesn't even matter. The damage is done, and I'm the one left to face the fallout. Each day, I'm reminded of what I've lost: my marriage, my reputation, my support system. I don't even recognize myself anymore. The person I've become is a far cry from the woman I used to be, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to get her back. All I can do now is try to rebuild, one painful step at a time. I didn't go to the police, though I thought about it many times. When the videos leaked, I was paralyzed with fear and shame. The idea of exposing everything even further, of bringing the authorities into a situation that was already humiliating, felt impossible. I knew the police could investigate, but I was terrified of the media, of people twisting the story even more. My reputation was already in ruins, and I couldn't imagine making it worse. As for confronting Baltasar, I did try to reach out to him. I begged him to take some responsibility, to help me at least financially or emotionally, especially since I was pregnant. When I mentioned the police, he dismissed me entirely. He said I had no proof that he leaked the videos and that I couldn't prove the child was his. His words were cold and calculating, and he made it clear that if I tried to involve the authorities, he'd fight back in ways that could destroy me even further. It felt like I was trapped. I didn't have the strength or resources to go up against someone like Baltasar. He had money, connections, and the ability to make my life even harder. And deep down, I blamed myself for being in this position. I thought, who would believe me? I had willingly participated in the videos. I had willingly betrayed my husband. I felt like I had no right to demand justice when I had been complicit in my own downfall. But as time has passed, I've started to question that mindset. Maybe I do have a right to stand up for myself, even if I made mistakes. Maybe I should have gone to the police, not just for myself, but for my child. At the time, I was too consumed by shame and fear to think clearly. Now, I realize that staying silent only gave Baltasar more power over me. It's too late to change what I did or didn't do back then. But if I ever find the courage to face him again, it won't be out of desperation. It'll be out of a desire to reclaim my voice and protect my child from the fallout of my mistakes. When I found out Baltasar had been arrested, I had mixed emotions. At first, there was a sense of relief, finally, some form of accountability. For a moment, it felt like the universe was delivering some justice for everything he had done, not just to me but perhaps to others he may have wronged. Knowing he had to face consequences, even temporarily, gave me a small glimmer of satisfaction. But that feeling didn't last long. After 3 weeks, he was released, and the reality of the situation hit me again. His release reminded me how little power I had in this whole ordeal. Baltasar had always been a man with resources, connections, and the ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. His arrest felt like a minor inconvenience to him, a hiccup he could brush off. I wasn't happy when he was released. If anything, I felt frustrated and helpless all over again. It was a reminder that justice isn't always fair or complete. Baltasar walked free, while I was still trapped in the aftermath of everything: the videos, the judgment, the loneliness, and the uncertainty of raising a child without any support from him or anyone else. If I'm honest, his arrest didn't change much for me. It didn't erase the pain or undo the damage. It didn't make him take responsibility for his actions or give me the closure I so desperately needed. Instead, it just felt like another chapter in this endless cycle of mistakes and consequences. At this point, I've learned not to pin my hopes on what happens to Baltasar. My focus now has to be on finding a way to move forward, for myself and my child, regardless of what happens to him. I have told Baltasar's wife about my pregnancy. I hoped that as a mother or someone who might value justice, she'd understand the gravity of the situation and persuade Baltasar to take responsibility not for me, but for the child we created. The moment I told her was one of the hardest and most humiliating experiences of my life. I reached out to her after weeks of agonizing over whether it was the right thing to do. My hands trembled as I dialed her number, unsure if she would even answer. When she picked up, her voice was calm but guarded, as though she could sense something wasn't right. I introduced myself as calmly as I could, though my voice shook with nerves. I told her that I needed to speak with her about something serious regarding her husband. She was silent for a moment before saying, "Go on." I explained everything: how Baltasar and I had an affair, how I ended up pregnant, and how he had abandoned me and refused to take any responsibility. Her reaction was nothing like I expected. She didn't yell or scream. Instead, she listened in cold silence, letting me pour out my story. When I finished, she took a deep breath and asked one question: "Why are you telling me this now?" I told her the truth, that I was at my wit's end, that I didn't want anything for myself, only that Baltasar should support his child. I explained that I had no other way to reach him and thought maybe, as his wife, she might be able to convince him to do the right thing. Her voice was steady but filled with bitterness when she responded. She said, "You think I didn't know who my husband is? You think you're the first? He's done this before, then he'll probably do it again. But don't think for a second that I'll fight your battles for you. This is between you and him. Don't drag me into it." Her words cut deep. I had hoped for understanding, maybe even some help, but instead, I was met with cold indifference. She told me that whatever Baltasar chose to do or not do, was his decision and that she wouldn't involve herself in his messes anymore. Then she hung up, leaving me feeling even more alone than before. That conversation was a harsh reminder that I couldn't rely on anyone else to solve this. Not Baltasar, not his wife, no one. I was on my own, and I would have to find the strength to deal with this for the sake of my child, no matter how unfair or overwhelming it felt. I met David about 8 years ago, long before my life took this dramatic turn. At the time, I was working as a junior associate at a marketing firm, and he was a software engineer at a tech company. We met through mutual friends at a small dinner party. I remember the moment we were introduced. David had this warm, genuine smile and a quiet confidence that immediately drew me to him. We clicked right away, talking about everything from our favorite movies to our career aspirations. David wasn't flashy or overly assertive, he had a calm, steady presence that made me feel safe. We exchanged numbers that night, and within a week, he called to ask me out on our first date. Our relationship developed naturally. David was thoughtful and attentive, always making an effort to show me how much he cared. Whether it was surprising me with my favorite coffee on a busy morning or planning a weekend getaway, he had a way of making me feel cherished. He was also a great listener, always encouraging me to share my thoughts and dreams. After 2 years of dating, David proposed. It was simple and heartfelt, just like him. He planned a picnic at our favorite park, where we had spent countless afternoons together. As we were watching the sunset, he pulled out a small box and got down on one knee. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he said, "Sophia, you're my best friend and the love of my life. I can't imagine a future without you. Will you marry me?" I was overwhelmed with happiness and didn't hesitate for a second before saying yes. The proposal wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect because it came from the heart. It was a promise of a life built on love, trust, and partnership. For years, that's exactly what we had. Our marriage wasn't perfect, no marriage is, but it was built on a solid foundation of respect and care for each other. Looking back, I realized just how much I took David for granted. He gave me so much, and I betrayed him in the worst way possible. The memory of our beginning only makes the end more painful. David was a good man, and he deserved better than what I gave him. If I could go back in time to that day in the park, I would say yes again, but this time, I would never let myself forget the weight of that promise. When David's parents found out what had happened, they were understandably devastated. They had always treated me like family, and I had grown very close to them over the years. I remember the first time I saw them after everything fell apart. It was in the aftermath of David leaving, and the truth had come out. David's mother, Margaret, was the first to speak. She had always been kind and patient with me, but now her eyes were filled with sorrow and disappointment. She didn't yell, but her voice wavered as she said, "Sophia, I don't even know where to begin. You've hurt David deeply, or more than I ever thought possible. You were the woman he trusted, the woman he built his life with." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing, "And now, I don't know how we can look at you the same way." Her words were like a dagger to my heart. David's father, John, was quieter, but his disapproval was just as clear. He had always been a man of few words, but his gaze held a certain weight when he looked at me. He simply said, "What you did was wrong, Sophia. There's no excuse for betrayal like that. We raised David to be a good man, and this is what he gets in return." It wasn't just anger in his voice, it was sadness, and a sense of mourning for the relationship they had once believed in. They didn't know about the pregnancy yet when I saw them. But the shame and the hurt they expressed were enough to make me feel small and insignificant. They loved David like a son, and now, in their eyes, I had destroyed something they thought was sacred. I had ruined their perception of me, and I knew that rebuilding their trust would be near impossible. When I later told them about the pregnancy, their reaction was a mixture of shock and disbelief. Margaret asked, "Why didn't you come to us sooner? Why didn't you ask for help?" I could see that she was heartbroken not just for David, but for the life that was now growing inside me. There was a sadness in her eyes, but it was mixed with a touch of anger too, anger at me for not taking responsibility for the consequences of my actions. In the end, they said very little after that. They distanced themselves from me. They didn't want to make any rash decisions while emotions were so high, but it was clear that they were disappointed in me, and that my actions had irrevocably changed how they saw me. They would likely never be able to forgive me for what I had done to their son. I don't blame them. I don't even know if I could forgive myself, let alone expect them to. They had every right to feel hurt, to feel betrayed, and to want to distance themselves from me. The loss of David and his family is a consequence of my choices, and I'm left with nothing but regret and the painful reality of how far I've fallen. When I look back on it now, I can hardly believe I allowed myself to be swayed by Baltasar's promises. He wasn't just charming, he knew exactly what to say to make me feel special, desired, and valued in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. In the beginning, Baltasar made me feel like I was the center of his world. He would tell me that he admired my intelligence, my independence, and the way I carried myself. He said I was different from the others, that I didn't need him, but that he wanted to be with me anyway. He made me feel like I was more than just a wife or someone's partner, I was his person, the one he wanted above all others. One of the biggest promises he made was that he saw a future with me. He told me that I was the woman he could see building a life with. He talked about how we could escape our routines, break free from the expectations of society, and be with each other without judgment. He painted this picture of a life full of excitement, passion, and freedom. He made me feel like I was missing out on something big, like there was a life beyond the one I was living with David that was so much more alive and thrilling. He also promised me that I would never have to feel alone. Baltasar made me believe that, in him, I would find a partner who truly understood me, who would support me, and who could provide something that was missing in my marriage. I convinced myself that this wasn't just an affair, it was a connection, something deeper that I couldn't ignore. In the moment, his words felt real. They felt like a validation of something I hadn't even fully realized I was missing. I was caught up in the idea of a passionate escape, of a life where I felt truly seen and desired. I told myself that David and I had been growing apart, that maybe we had become too comfortable, too predictable. I thought Baltasar could give me something that would reignite that spark I was longing for. But looking back now, I see that all of those promises were lies, or at the very least, fantasies that Baltasar used to manipulate me. He wasn't offering me a future, he was offering a fleeting escape, and I fell for it. In the end, those promises meant nothing. I had lost the love of my life, and all I had left was regret and the painful reality of the choices I had made. I allowed myself to be manipulated. I was an active participant in my own choices, and I take responsibility for the role I played in that dynamic. Each person is responsible for their own actions, and I allowed myself to be swept up in what he promised, which was ultimately a lie. That said, I can see how others might fall into similar traps, especially if Baltasar used the same tactics with them. He's someone who knows how to charm and flatter, and he preys on vulnerabilities, whether it's the desire for attention, love, or validation. But again, while manipulation is a powerful tool in the hands of someone like him, I believe that women or anyone who gets caught up in these situations have their own reasons for being vulnerable at that time, and those reasons are personal and unique. In my case, I wasn't looking for validation from another person, but Baltasar made me feel seen in a way that I hadn't felt in a while. That feeling was intoxicating, and I let myself believe the fantasy he painted, despite the reality that it was never going to be as perfect as he made it seem. It's tragic that others might have gone through similar experiences, but it's important to remember that manipulation, in any form, can happen to anyone. It's not about blaming the victim or assuming that they caused the manipulation, it's about understanding how powerful emotional influence can be and why it's crucial to stay aware of our own vulnerabilities. I deeply regret my choices and the consequences they had, not just on myself, but on those I loved. But I know that my story is just one example, and each person who gets involved in toxic relationships has their own journey. I wish more women and men would see the red flags earlier, before it's too late. But ultimately, we can only learn from our mistakes and try to be better moving forward. The scandal with Baltasar has been one of the most painful and transformative experiences of my life, and in many ways, it has taught me hard but valuable lessons. First and foremost, it taught me about the importance of self-respect and boundaries. I allowed myself to be swept up in emotions, promises, and fantasies, and in doing so, I lost sight of who I was and what I truly wanted out of life. I learned that no matter how appealing a situation may seem in the moment, I must always stay true to myself, my values, and my commitments. Betraying those things, whether it's to myself or to others, only leads to regret. I also learned about the dangers of relying on external validation to fill internal voids. I thought I needed to feel special, desired, or validated by someone outside of my relationship with David. But I've realized now that those things need to come from within. True fulfillment can only come when we are at peace with ourselves and our choices. Relying on someone else's attention or affection as a source of validation only sets us up for disappointment. Another hard lesson was about the consequences of our actions. I didn't just hurt David, I hurt myself, my family, and the future I could have had. The betrayal shattered my relationship with people I cared about, and it destroyed the trust that had been built over years. No decision in life is ever isolated, and the consequences of one wrong move can ripple out, affecting many others. I learned the importance of thinking carefully before making decisions that could change the course of our lives forever. Lastly, the scandal taught me about forgiveness, specifically, the difficulty of forgiving myself. I've spent so much time feeling ashamed and thinking that I didn't deserve another chance at happiness. But I've learned that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning to accept it and move forward. I'm not perfect, and I made terrible mistakes, but I can't let those mistakes define me forever. The hardest part of all is living with the knowledge that I've hurt people I loved, and that there may be no way to repair everything I've damaged. But I have to keep going, for myself and my child. The scandal has shown me that redemption is possible, but it requires real effort, self-awareness, and change. It's not about going back to the past, but about learning to make better choices in the future.
Hayatımızın gedişatını əbədi olaraq